The information environment divides polls. State-linked polls show continued confidence in the leadership and optimism that people with mental disabilities to the front lines to make up for the shortage of soldiers. Yes, you heard that right.
The winter of 2025 opened with a question that few military planners in Moscow expected to hear. How did the climate that once shielded Russia's armies become one of their deadliest enemies? For centuries, cold weather had been woven into Russia's strategic mythology as a silent ally that exhausted invaders and bought time for counteroffensives. This time, however, Russian forces were not defending deep territory. They were advancing across exposed ground in eastern Ukraine, and winter arrived not as protection, but as punishment. Temperatures plunged well below freezing across the Donetsk region, winds intensified across open fields, and frozen soil turned simple survival into a daily struggle. The shift in roles transformed cold weather from a buffer into a threat, magnifying every weakness already present in Russia's campaign. The most immediate impact appeared on the front lines around Pokrovsk and nearby settlements, where Russian assaults slowed to a crawl as weather conditions deteriorated. Offensive units found themselves immobilized by ice-hardened terrain that could not be dug into quickly enough for cover. Vehicles broke down under sustained cold stress fuel, thickened batteries drained faster than anticipated, and resupply schedules slipped further behind. These were not isolated inconveniences, but systemic disruptions that eroded momentum day after day. Soldiers advancing on foot carried everything they had, knowing that any attempt to generate heat or light risked immediate detection. What should have been routine winter adaptation instead exposed a lack of preparation that compounded losses without producing meaningful gains. The shock lay not in the cold itself, but in how unready the Russian offensive proved to be for it. Modern armies operating in harsh climates depend on layered logistics, rapid troop rotation, and specialized equipment designed for extended exposure. In this case, winter arrived while units were already strained by manpower shortages, exhausted from months of fighting, and reliant on fragile supply lines. Cold weather acted as a force multiplier for these existing problems. Frostbite and hypothermia spread quietly through trenches and temporary positions, sidelining soldiers before combat even began. Minor injuries that might have been survivable in warmer months became fatal when evacuation routes froze or vehicles failed to arrive on time. The psychological impact was equally corrosive. Soldiers trained to expect winter hardship as part of defensive doctrine now faced it while being ordered forward into contested terrain. Morale suffered as assaults stalled and casualties mounted without visible progress. The symbolic power of winter, once invoked to inspire endurance, now worked in reverse. Each freezing night reinforced the sense that the environment itself was hostile, not just the opposing force. This perception spread upward through the ranks, feeding frustration among officers tasked with maintaining pressure under conditions that visibly undermined combat effectiveness. Strategically, the reversal exposed a deeper flaw in planning. Russian doctrine historically leveraged climate defensively, assuming the enemy would bear the brunt of logistical strain. In Ukraine, that assumption no longer held. Ukrainian forces operating closer to established supply hubs and fortified positions were better positioned to rotate troops, distribute winter gear, and adapt defenses to the season. The contrast highlighted how environmental factors favor the side that can pause, consolidate, and absorb pressure, rather than the one compelled to attack continuously. Winter did not change the balance overnight, but it steadily tipped it by slowing operations and increasing non-combat losses. This early phase of winter fighting sent a clear signal: climate is neutral only on paper. In practice, it amplifies preparation and punishes neglect. As Russian forces pressed forward despite worsening conditions, the cold stripped away the last illusions of an effortless seasonal advantage. What remained was a grinding test of endurance that exposed structural weaknesses rather than concealing them. With winter tightening its grip and the offensive showing signs of strain, the question now becomes unavoidable. If the opening weeks revealed such vulnerabilities, how much worse will the battlefield reality become as the cold deepens and resources thin further? As winter tightened its hold on eastern Ukraine, the reality on the ground around the Pokrovsk sector began to diverge sharply from official claims of momentum. This stretch of the front, long viewed as a gateway for deeper advances, turned into a proving ground for how environmental pressure could stall even determined offensives. Snow-covered fields, frozen roads, and sub-zero nights reshaped daily operations. Units attempting to push forward found themselves exposed in open terrain where the cold was as dangerous as enemy fire. Every movement required calculation, not only to avoid detection, but to conserve energy in conditions that drained strength at alarming speed. Russian assaults in this area followed a familiar pattern: short advances, brief contact, and then a halt as casualties mounted and coordination broke down. Winter intensified these patterns. Frozen ground made it nearly impossible to dig new positions quickly, forcing soldiers to rely on shallow cover or improvised shelters that offered little protection from wind and cold. The inability to fortify effectively left troops vulnerable, prolonging exposure and increasing the risk of frost-related injuries. Vehicles already scarce near the front struggled to operate reliably, turning resupply into an unpredictable gamble rather than a scheduled lifeline. In contrast, Ukrainian defenders benefited from positional advantages that winter reinforced rather than undermined. Established fortifications, pre-stocked shelters, and more consistent logistical access allowed rotations to continue even as conditions worsened. This did not eliminate hardship, but it reduced its cumulative impact. Soldiers could cycle out of the cold, receive medical attention, and return with functional gear. The asymmetry was subtle but decisive. One side endured winter while holding ground. The other attempted to fight through it while advancing. Over time, that difference shaped outcomes more powerfully than any single engagement. The operational tempo reflected this imbalance. Attacks that might have been planned as coordinated pushes devolved into fragmented probes, often limited by how long troops could physically remain exposed. Commanders faced an unenviable choice between pressing forward with depleted units or pausing to regroup and risk losing initiative. In practice, pauses became longer and advances shorter. The front line hardened into a static contest where movement carried disproportionate risk. Winter did not freeze the battlefield entirely, but it slowed it enough to neutralize the advantages of mass and momentum. Logistical strain amplified these effects. Supplies that arrived late or in insufficient quantities forced units to ration essentials from fuel to food. Even minor delays carried serious consequences when temperatures hovered far below freezing. Soldiers lacking adequate insulation or heating options faced compounding health risks with each passing night. Medical evacuation, already difficult under fire, became more dangerous as icy roads and mechanical failures multiplied. Each casualty left behind represented not just a loss of manpower, but a blow to morale that echoed through units already under stress. The battlefield around Pokrovsk thus became less about sweeping maneuvers and more about endurance. Success depended on which side could sustain presence longer without collapsing under environmental pressure. For Ukrainian forces, winter reinforced a defensive strategy built on patience and attrition. For Russian troops, it exposed the fragility of an offensive that relied on constant pressure without the infrastructure to support it in extreme conditions. The gap between intention and capability widened with each cold snap, turning weather into an unplanned arbiter of progress. As winter deepened and days grew shorter, the front showed little sign of dramatic breakthroughs. Instead, it revealed a slow erosion of offensive capacity, shaped by cold fatigue and logistical limits. The situation raised a pressing question for the months ahead. If winter has already constrained operations so severely in this sector, what does that mean for an army attempting sustained advances across multiple fronts under the same unforgiving conditions? Behind the frozen front lines, the deeper crisis revealed itself not in dramatic battlefield footage, but in the quiet accumulation of logistical failures and human suffering. Winter transformed routine shortcomings into life-threatening hazards, exposing how fragile the support structure had become for Russian forces operating under sustained pressure. Supplies that might have sufficed in milder conditions proved inadequate once temperatures plunged. Cold weather gear was inconsistent, heating options were scarce, and even basic necessities arrived sporadically. The result was a frontline environment where survival increasingly depended on improvisation rather than planning. Equipment failures multiplied as winter stress tested every system. Vehicles designed for short operations struggled with prolonged exposure to extreme cold. Engines failed to start, fuel thickened, and batteries drained rapidly, leaving units isolated at critical moments. When transport broke down, resupply shifted to foot movement, further limiting what soldiers could carry. This constraint had a cascading effect: fewer rations, less medical equipment, and almost no margin for error. In such conditions, even small mistakes became fatal. A torn glove, a soaked boot, or a delayed delivery could lead to frostbite or hypothermia within hours. Medical support, already strained by the pace of operations, suffered the most severe consequences. Evacuation timelines stretched dangerously as icy roads slowed movement and mechanical failures became routine. Wounded soldiers often waited far longer than planned for extraction, if extraction arrived at all. Injuries that might have been survivable during warmer months turned deadly when combined with prolonged exposure. The cold acted as an invisible accelerant, worsening blood loss, slowing treatment, and increasing shock. Each delayed evacuation reinforced the perception that frontline units were expendable, eroding trust between soldiers and command. The human cost extended beyond physical injury. Prolonged exposure to extreme conditions degraded mental resilience, amplifying fatigue and fear. Soldiers, forced to remain motionless to avoid detection, endured hours of cold that numbed limbs and clouded judgment. Sleep deprivation became common as maintaining warmth competed with rest. Over time, these stresses reduced combat effectiveness even among those who remained physically capable. Units rotated less frequently, and when rotations did occur, replacements often arrived with minimal preparation for winter fighting, perpetuating the cycle. Logistical breakdowns also undermined coordination at higher levels. Commanders planning operations faced incomplete information as communication equipment failed or required additional power that was unavailable. The cold shortened the operational window for electronics, forcing difficult choices about when and how to deploy drones, radios, and navigation tools. These limitations reduced situational awareness, increasing the risk of miscalculation. In a conflict where precision and timing matter, winter amplified the cost of every logistical misstep. Comparatively, forces able to maintain steady supply chains and medical evacuation gained a significant advantage without changing tactics. The contrast highlighted how modern warfare rewards sustainability as much as firepower. Cold weather did not discriminate, but preparation did. Where logistics adapted, winter became manageable. Where they faltered, it became lethal. The suffering endured on the front lines thus reflected not only environmental hardship, but strategic neglect. As winter continued to expose these vulnerabilities, the question shifted from whether losses could be reduced to whether the system itself could adapt in time. With equipment wearing down and human endurance stretched thin, how long can an army sustain offensive pressure when logistics and medical support lag so dangerously behind the demands of winter warfare? The idea of General Winter has long occupied a powerful place in military history, symbolizing the brutal climate that once shielded Russia from invaders. From earlier European campaigns to 20th century wars, winter was remembered as a silent ally that punished overextended enemies and bought time for recovery. Yet, in the context of the current conflict, that myth has inverted. When Russia shifted from defending its territory to sustaining offensive operations across contested ground, the same environmental forces that once protected it became strategic liabilities. Winter no longer slowed an invading army from afar. It now weighed directly on Russian troops exposed at the front. This reversal carries profound implications. Historical precedents show that climate advantages favor defenders with depth reserves and infrastructure. In past conflicts, Russia absorbed winter by retreating, consolidating, and letting the environment weaken its enemies. In Ukraine, Russian forces lack that luxury. They are tasked with maintaining pressure across long, vulnerable lines, while operating in areas where fortifications are incomplete and supply routes remain contested. Winter in this setting does not buy time. It consumes it. Every frozen night accelerates wear on equipment, drains manpower, and compresses the window for effective operations. The myth of winter as a universal equalizer also obscures a more nuanced reality of modern warfare. Climate alone does not decide outcomes. Adaptation does. Armies that integrate weather planning into logistics training and command structures can mitigate even severe conditions. Those that rely on historical assumptions without matching preparation risk being undone by the very factors they once celebrated. In this case, the persistence of winter mythology delayed recognition of how dramatically the operational context had changed. Planning assumptions built around endurance and sacrifice proved insufficient without the logistical backbone to support them. Winter's impact further exposed the limits of centralized command structures under stress. Adjusting tactics in response to environmental conditions requires flexibility at lower levels, yet rigid expectations of constant offensive pressure restricted local adaptation. Units that might have benefited from pauses to consolidate or fortify instead faced orders that prioritized movement over sustainability. This disconnect magnified losses and reinforced the sense that winter was not merely an obstacle but a force actively working against operational goals. The strategic cost extended beyond immediate battlefield outcomes. As winter stalled advances and highlighted weaknesses, it undermined deterrence narratives built on momentum and inevitability. Allies and adversaries alike observed that environmental hardship could neutralize numerical advantages when preparation lagged. For Ukraine and its partners, this reinforced confidence in defensive resilience. For Russia, it raised uncomfortable questions about whether long-held assumptions still applied in a conflict defined by technology precision and sustained logistics rather than sheer endurance. Ultimately, the collapse of the General Winter myth underscores a broader lesson about modern conflict history, offers guidance, not guarantees. Conditions that once shaped outcomes cannot be assumed to function the same way under new strategic realities. Winter remains powerful, but it is no longer loyal by default. Its effects depend on who is better prepared to absorb them. As this realization sinks in, a critical question emerges for planners on all sides. If traditional environmental advantages can reverse so dramatically, what other inherited assumptions about warfare may already be failing under the pressures of today's conflicts? As winter exposed structural weaknesses, The strain on manpower became impossible to ignore. Sustained losses, exhaustion, and the physical toll of extreme conditions reshaped the composition of forces on the front. Units increasingly reflected a broader manpower crisis, rather than a carefully balanced fighting force. The pool of experienced, well-trained soldiers thinned, while replacements often arrived with limited preparation for both combat and climate. Winter magnified this disparity, turning inexperience into a direct risk factor rather than a manageable shortcoming. Morale deteriorated alongside physical readiness. Soldiers confronted not only the dangers of combat, but the daily reality of cold that seeped into every aspect of life. Prolonged exposure eroded confidence in leadership, particularly when orders appeared disconnected from conditions on the ground. Requests for rotation or reassignment grew more frequent as officers and enlisted personnel alike sought relief from a front that offered little shelter and fewer signs of progress. The cumulative effect was a breakdown in cohesion that no amount of rhetoric could easily repair. Desperation bred improvisation. As traditional capabilities faltered, unconventional tactics emerged to compensate for gaps in manpower and equipment. These measures reflected urgency rather than innovation, often prioritizing immediate utility over long-term effectiveness. Winter conditions made such improvisation even riskier as cold reduced tolerance for error. Soldiers tasked with roles beyond their training faced heightened danger, while units stretched thin struggled to maintain situational awareness. Each stopgap solution addressed a symptom, but not the underlying cause, further entrenching systemic strain. The quality of manpower also shifted in ways that affected operational outcomes. Older recruits and individuals with limited physical resilience faced disproportionate hardship in freezing conditions. Tasks that demanded endurance and rapid movement became punishing, reducing overall combat efficiency. The reliance on less capable personnel forced commanders to adjust tactics downward, favoring smaller, less ambitious actions that aligned with available resources. Winter thus not only reduced numbers, but reshaped the nature of operations themselves, narrowing strategic options. At the leadership level, the pressure manifested in declining confidence and increased attrition. Officers confronted with the prospect of prolonged winter exposure weighed personal risk against duty, particularly when support systems appeared unreliable. Requests for reassignment away from frontline positions signaled a deeper crisis of faith. While such requests did not always result in immediate changes, their volume reflected widespread recognition that winter had tipped the balance from hardship to hazard. The cold became a catalyst for decisions that would have seemed unthinkable under different circumstances. These developments carried strategic implications beyond individual units. An army's effectiveness depends not only on numbers, but on the willingness of its personnel to endure and adapt. Winter accelerated the erosion of that willingness by stripping away the buffers that normally sustain morale. As manpower quality declined and improvisation replaced planning, the offensive lost coherence. The battlefield became a test of endurance that disproportionately favored the side able to preserve human capital. With winter still exerting pressure and the manpower crisis deepening, the trajectory appeared increasingly constrained. The question moving forward is not simply how many soldiers remain, but how many can function effectively under such conditions. As this reality sets in, how will prolonged winter stress reshape decisions at the strategic level where manpower morale and political considerations converge? By early 2025, the consequences of winter's impact extended far beyond the frozen trenches of eastern Ukraine, shaping strategic calculations across Europe and beyond. What began as a seasonal challenge evolved into a broader signal about the limits of sustained offensive warfare under environmental stress. For Russia, winter revealed how quickly momentum could be blunted, when logistics, manpower, and morale faltered simultaneously. For NATO, the United States, and allied partners, these developments offered critical insights into how climate preparation and resilience intersect in modern conflict. The most immediate strategic implication lay in deterrence. Observers noted that numerical strength and massed assaults proved far less decisive when environmental pressure exposed systemic weaknesses. This reinforced the importance of readiness over sheer scale. Western planners drew lessons about the value of layered logistics, winterized equipment, and troop rotation in sustaining operations. The contrast underscored that adaptability, not endurance alone, defines success in prolonged conflicts. Winter, once considered a background factor, emerged as an active variable that could alter timelines and outcomes. These lessons resonated beyond Ukraine. As global tensions persisted across multiple theaters, including the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific, the role of climate and logistics gained renewed attention. Cold weather in Eastern Europe, heat in the Middle East, and humidity in maritime regions all pose unique challenges that reward preparation and punish neglect. The Russian experience demonstrated that failing to integrate environmental realities into strategic planning can neutralize advantages in manpower or firepower. This realization reinforced the emphasis on joint exercises, supply chain resilience, and forward planning within Western defense frameworks. Politically, winter-induced setbacks carried symbolic weight. They challenged narratives of inevitability and exposed vulnerabilities that allies and adversaries alike scrutinized closely. For Western governments, the situation validated continued support for defensive resilience, showing that sustained assistance could yield tangible effects without dramatic escalations. It also strengthened arguments for long-term investment in logistics and training, rather than short-term surges. The message was clear: endurance is built over years, not improvised under pressure. At the strategic level, Winter's role highlighted the interconnectedness of military and political decision-making. Prolonged hardship affects not only battlefield outcomes, but domestic perceptions, alliance cohesion, and diplomatic leverage. An army struggling to sustain operations under environmental stress faces constraints that ripple outward, influencing negotiation positions and long-term planning. The winter of 2025 thus became more than a seasonal chapter. It became a case study in how non-combat factors can shape the trajectory of a war. As the season progressed, attention shifted from immediate outcomes to lasting lessons. Climate, once treated as a constant, demanded renewed respect as a dynamic force. Preparation, adaptability, and human resilience emerged as decisive factors that no amount of historical mythology could replace. For strategists across NATO and beyond, the unfolding situation served as a reminder that modern warfare rewards those who plan for the environment as carefully as they plan for the enemy. With winter continuing to influence operations and strategic thinking alike, the final question remains open-ended. How will these lessons reshape future military planning, alliance cooperation, and public engagement in an era where environmental realities increasingly intersect with global security decisions?